Encouraging, empowering, inspiring each other on this journey of faith. United in purpose, sisters in love we are. Women World Leaders.
Welcome to Women World Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Julie Harwick. Thank you for joining me today as we celebrate God's grace in our lives, in this ministry, and around the world. What's in a name? Deep meaning and significance. Your name tells others who you are. When someone else mentions it to others, your image and likely your character comes to mind. Most of us have 3 or maybe 4 names that are officially ours. Some have nicknames, stage names, or pen names, but only God has a myriad of names, and still, they fail to adequately describe Him. There are many instances in Scripture where God revealed a specific attribute of His character to an individual in a moment of critical need. One of my favorites is the story of Hagar, an Egyptian slave girl who came to know Him as El Roi, the God who sees. As a woman, a foreigner, and a slave, Hagar was probably used to being invisible to her master and mistress, Abram and Sarai. In her culture, slaves weren't thought of much differently than camels or donkeys. They needed food, shelter, clothing, and direction, nothing more. When Sarai realized that her window of opportunity to conceive a child with Abram had closed, she took matters into her own hands and instigated the first known surrogate pregnancy in biblical history. We don't know how old Hagar was, but she was of childbearing age, and as a slave, her owners considered her womb to belong to them just as much as the rest of her did. While she probably didn't appreciate being used for breeding purposes, her pregnancy with Abram's child elevated her position in the household dramatically. No doubt the fact that she was carrying precious cargo probably exempted her from much of the work she had previously been expected to do, and led her to view Sarai more as a competitor for Abram's attention rather than her mistress. One translation says that she began to despise her mistress. Sarai also noticed the changes in Hagar's attitude and began to question the wisdom of her plan. Whether it was Hagar's cockiness or Sarai's insecurity, we don't know, but to say that their relationship was strained would be a serious understatement. Sarai's hostility toward Hagar became so intense that Hagar felt she had to escape. She fled into the desert, and while she was resting near a well, an angel approached her, called her by name, and asked her where she came from and where she was going. Hagar admitted that she was running away from her mistress. The angel told her to return to Sarai and submit to her, promising that Hagar would one day have descendants too numerous to count. If she had any doubt that he was a messenger from God, they disappeared when he told her that she was carrying a boy who was to be named Ishmael, meaning God hears, because the Lord had heard of her misery. Suddenly, the slave who had always been unseen and unheard by all those who had power over her knew that she had been seen and heard by the one who had power over everything. Genesis 16:13 says, "She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are El Roi, the God who sees me, for I have now seen the one who sees me." Knowing that she was not invisible and that she did have a voice, gave Hagar the courage to return to her mistress and give birth to Abram's son Ishmael, just as the angel had predicted. But that wasn't the end of her story. When Ishmael was born, all of Abram and Sarai's hopes were placed in him. Hagar knew her place was secure since she was the natural choice to do the everyday work of caring for him. But by the time he reached his teens, the situation had changed quite a bit. Abram and Sarai had become Abraham and Sarah as God changed their names and made a covenant with them. He promised them a child of their own through Sarah, and after a very long wait, he enabled 90-year-old Sarah to conceive and deliver Isaac. Ishmael was still a son of Abraham, but all the love and attention that had once been his was now devoted to baby Isaac. Like any normal teenage boy, Ishmael was constantly teasing and mocking his baby brother. But Sarah was not having it. Since Hagar's son no longer served any purpose in Sarah's world, other than to potentially threaten Isaac's inheritance and Abraham's attention, she demanded that her husband get rid of Hagar and her son. Although Abraham still loved and cherished Ishmael, God made it clear to him that because his son with Hagar was not part of the covenant, he should honor Sarah's wishes and send the slave and her son away. He also assured Abraham that he had a plan for Hagar and Ishmael as well. The next morning, Abraham provided them with food and water and sent them on their way. Hagar headed into the desert, and before long, the water Abraham had given them was gone, but there was no water in sight. She had Ishmael lay under a bush while she went some distance away and sobbed, thinking that she couldn't bear to watch him die. Once again, the angel of the Lord appeared and told her not to be afraid. Reminding her of the meaning of the name God had given her for her son, the angel said, "God has heard the boy crying and will make a great nation of him." For a second time, God had met Hagar in the desert in her moment of desperation. He had seen and heard her as a slave, and now he saw and heard her as a free woman with nowhere to go and no one to provide for her. He opened her eyes to see a well where they could find much needed water, and he promised to make a great nation of Ishmael. Genesis 16:20 says that God was with the boy as he grew up, and that they lived in the desert, and Ishmael became an archer. God couldn't have chosen a better person to reveal himself in this way than Hagar, the Egyptian slave. When we feel as if we don't belong, invisible and unheard, we can be confident that God not only sees and hears us, but knows our situation and has a plan for us. When everyone around us is only interested in how we can serve their purposes, God is not only aware of us, but is also working to complete his purpose in us. Soon after Hagar and Ishmael disappeared into the desert, Abraham had an encounter with God too, and introduced another name for him to our vocabulary. When baby Isaac grew to be a teenager, God called Abraham to the greatest test of his life. He'd already been tested by God when he was asked to leave his home country and live as a nomad in the land God would give him. And the promised child that would make him the father of a great nation didn't arrive until he was 100 years old. Abraham had experienced God's tests of his faith on multiple occasions, but this one was beyond belief. In Genesis 22:2, God said, "Take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." While pagan nations around him may have embraced child sacrifice, Abraham's people never had. He was accustomed to sacrificing sheep, goats, and birds, but the son he had waited a century for? I doubt he got much sleep that night, but the Bible tells us that early the next morning he set out for Mount Moriah with a couple of servants and his beloved son Isaac. It took them 3 days to reach the mountain, and I suspect Abraham was unusually quiet as he tried to make sense of what God had asked him to do. Part of his thought process had to be to recall every promise that God had made to him and how he had faithfully carried out each one. How God had intervened on his behalf, poured out blessings on him, and rescued him from peril. How he had miraculously given Sarah and him a child at the advanced ages of 90 and 100. The book of Hebrews sheds some light on what he may have been thinking. Hebrews 11:18 through 19 says, "Even though God had told him, 'Isaac is the son through whom your descendants will be counted,' Abraham reasoned that if Isaac died, God was able to bring him back to life again." As painful as it would be to follow through with God's command, Abraham resolved to obey. Even when Isaac noted that they had the wood and the fire, but no animal for the sacrifice, Abraham simply replied that God would provide a sacrifice. If I had been Abraham, I suspect I would have been moving very slowly, hoping that each added step of obedience would be sufficient to prove my commitment, and God would mercifully not require me to actually kill my son. But for Abraham, it didn't appear that that was going to happen. He tied Isaac's hands together, lifted him onto the altar, and raised the knife over his head. And it was not until that moment that God intervened and revealed himself as Jehovah Jireh, the Lord will provide. Genesis 22 says that an angel of the Lord called out to him to stop, that he had proven that he would not withhold anything from the Lord, not even his only son. As Abraham looked up, he saw a ram caught by its horns in a nearby thicket. God had provided a sacrifice, exactly as he told Isaac that he would. All along, Abraham had believed that God was his provider, but in this moment, he had an entirely new understanding of what that really meant. Not only did God provide Abraham with land, food and water, possessions, and a child, he even provided the required sacrifice. Although Abraham may not have realized it, his whole experience was symbolic of what was to come. Mankind was incapable of providing a sacrifice that would permanently erase the sin that separated them from God. So God himself provided the sole acceptable sacrifice, his only son, Jesus. He provided that for Abraham, and he provides for us all. Another man who met God in the wilderness was Moses. When he encountered the bush that burned but was never consumed, we could describe him as a man with an identity crisis. Though he was raised by an Egyptian princess with all the benefits and privileges of Pharaoh's court, it seems like he never felt that he belonged in that world. Scripture makes it clear that he knew that he was a Hebrew who had been rescued from certain death as an infant. At the age of 40, he was confronted with a situation that forced him to choose between loyalty to his Hebrew birthright or the Egyptians who had raised him. When he encountered an Egyptian slave driver mercilessly beating a Hebrew slave, he impulsively killed the Egyptian to rescue his fellow Hebrew. In murdering the slave driver, he had unwittingly made a permanent choice to live as a Hebrew in exile. He hastily buried the man he had killed, but soon realized that his life was now in danger and fled to the wilderness to escape execution. So he was a Hebrew now, but a Hebrew what? The education he'd received in Pharaoh's court did nothing to prepare him for a life in the wilderness of Midian. He was fortunate enough to encounter a compassionate Midianite, Jethro, who offered him a home and ultimately a wife, as well as a new career as a shepherd. Just as Moses had spent his first 40 years in Egypt trying to figure out who he was, he spent another 40 years guarding his father-in-law's flocks and wondering why God had put him on this earth. Scripture doesn't really tell us what Moses knew about God. Because of his Egyptian upbringing, he probably had a basic knowledge of the God of the Hebrews, understanding that they only had one God who wasn't represented by any material idols. But since his biological mother probably had no contact with him after he was weaned, it's likely that he knew very little about the God of the Hebrews. Later in his story, we discover that he had never bothered to circumcise his son, which further demonstrates how little he knew of the Hebrew God. The burning bush that was not consumed captivated him, and when he heard an audible voice telling him to remove his shoes because he was standing on holy ground, he got an instant and terrifying introduction to the God who had previously been a mystery. Moses' whole conversation with God at the burning bush is filled with excuses. It's obvious that Moses feels completely out of his element and has no confidence in his ability to carry out God's plan. It's easy to judge him for his response until we consider how little experience he had with God and how badly he probably believed he had botched his life up to this point. At 80 years old, he still didn't really know who he was or why he was here, and his knowledge of God wasn't very deep either. But God's answer to his first question told him all he really needed to know. When the man with the identity crisis asked, "Who am I to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt?" God answered, "I will be with you." Revealing his lack of experience with God, Moses further questioned, "When they ask me the name of the God who sent me, what should I tell them?" "I am who I am," in all caps was the answer. Jehovah, or in Hebrew, Yahweh, the name the ancient Hebrews considered too holy to even pronounce or write out completely. It was probably not the answer Moses was expecting. It wasn't really a name like any other, and it was the first time God had ever expressed it to man. It's not the type of name we're accustomed to. A more modern translation would be that Jehovah means the self-existent one. Just as we read in Revelation, he is the one who was and is to come. As the only truly eternal being, he always was and always will be. It's a hard concept for our time-oriented minds to grasp. As complicated and mystifying as God's answer to Moses was, it was exactly what he needed to hear. It didn't matter what Moses had been or might have been, or what skills or knowledge he brought to the job. The only thing that mattered was that he'd been selected and enabled by the great I Am. Everything that needed to happen in order to free the Hebrews from Egypt would be provided through Moses by Jehovah. Every purpose God intended for him would be fulfilled in his final 40 years. Moses would find his true identity and purpose in developing a close relationship with the great I Am. That truth is as relevant to us today as it was to Moses in his calling. What we bring to the table isn't nearly as important as who we give it to. The I am who I am will lead and empower us to fulfill his purposes just as he did with Moses. As Abraham learned, Jehovah Jireh will provide for our every need, especially the ones we are completely incapable of meeting on our own. And no matter what trial we may face, how unseen or unheard our desperation may seem, he is El Roy, the God who sees and knows everything about us, the one who loves and cares for us when it seems that no one else does. No one name could adequately describe such an awesome being, and there are many more to be investigated. Please join me again December 8th to take another deep dive into the names of God. Thanks for listening to Women World Leaders Podcast. Join us each week as we explore together God's extravagant love and your courageous purpose. Visit our website at womenworldleaders.com to submit a prayer request, register for an upcoming event, and support the ministry. From His heart to yours, we are Women World Leaders. All content is copyrighted by Women World Leaders and cannot be used without written consent.